that it can end up being meaning you have a much less productive workforce than would be the case if there weren't barriers to women's participation. There are other arguments for wanting to reduce barriers to women's employment. There's evidence that women are working and they're earning more, they have more say in household decisions, and that tends to lead to high levels of savings with positive effects on economic growth, and also to greater investment in the next generation in terms of human capital, both health and education, which also leads to future economic growth. So there are a couple of studies that tried to quantify the effect of gender inequality on economic growth and output. There's one that uses data from 37 European countries and estimates that total output is somewhere between 6.4 and 8.7% lower as a result of barriers to women's entry. And then there's another one that uses data from 7 countries and finds that moving from the country with the lowest value of the UN Gender Inequality Index to the highest value is associated with a decrease of about 4 percentage points in the growth rate. So large negative economic consequences as a result of gender inequality. So now I'm going to go and talk about the work that we've done in there, but I'm just going to start by giving you a few definitions. So we're going to think of people as either working or not working, and so working is basically labour force participation, although labour force participation does technically also include people who are looking for work. And then those people who are working are either working in the formal sector or the informal sector. And if you're working in the sector, formal sector workers, we largely think of them as being wage workers or employees. And informal sector workers, we largely think of being as unpaid workers or people who are in employment, in kind of a small scale self-employment. So we're going to be talking about labour force participation, and then we're going to be focusing to a larger extent on the formal. So this first graph just shows you that female labour force participation in Indonesia is low compared to other countries in the region. So we've ranked the countries here in terms of GDP per capita, and you can see that Indonesia, shown in red, has low female labour force participation with about 50% of women working, and it's the second lowest in the region. Malaysia is lower, Philippines is very similar. What's possibly more surprising is that not only is it low, but it also hasn't changed over time. So the red line shows women's labour force participation in Indonesia from 1990 to about 2015, and it's remained constant at about 50%. And that's despite changes in the structure of the economy, less reliance on agriculture, increasing industrialisation and urbanisation, increases in incomes, and increases in educational attainment and declines in fertility rates. So that's somewhat surprising. Here we just graph labour force participation by age. So in the graph on the left-hand side, we have a blue line for men and a red line for women. And you can see that women's labour force participation is lower across every age, and there's the largest gap between men and women is during those child-rearing ages, between, say, ages of 20 and 45. The graph on the right shows the same figures, but for married and unmarried women. So unmarried women are shown in red and married women shown in green. And you can see that the age trajectory of unmarried women looks very much like men's. It's a bit lower, but otherwise similar. Whereas you can see for married women, you have a much lower labour force participation during those child rears. So it's pretty clear that child rearing and to some extent marriage are a form of barrier to women's employment. Now, the gender wage gap. This graph just shows you the ratio of women's wages to men's wages taken from a range of studies over a number of years. It shows an increase in the ratio, so that's an improvement in terms of women's earning capacity relative to men, but you still end up with a relatively large gap with women earning less than 80% of the male wage in about 2013. So what we did is we sought to determine how much of the difference in the wages that men and women receive is due to differences in their productive characteristics, so things like education, experience, even the industry in which they work. And what we found is that only 38% of the wage gap on average can be explained by the different skills of men and women. In fact, women are on average better educated in Indonesia than men slightly, and so if you take education into account, it ends up in wage gap look even worse. So 62% of the difference is unexplained, and so that will largely be reflecting differential treatment of men and women in the labour market, and hence discrimination. The figure shows you the same exercise conducted across the distribution of wages. And so at the bottom end of the distribution, so where people are earning very low wages, the wage gaps are huge. So women, the wage gap is 63%, so women are on average only earning about 37% of male wage at the lower end of the distribution, and only 39% of that wage difference can be explained. The rest is likely due to differential treatment. Up the top end of the distribution, there's still a wage gap, but it's much smaller, with women earning approximately 87% of the male wage and only 50%, so that's small, but still only 50% of that difference in wage can be explained. So we call this phenomenon where you have a larger wage gap at the bottom distribution sticky floors, whereas if you have a larger gap at the top end of the distribution, that reflects glass ceilings. So the Indonesian labour is largely characterised by having sticky floors. So now moving on to women's labour market transitions. So the data that used up to this point was from the Susunas. So it's observing lots of different women, but just at one point in time. So now what we do is we move on to use the Indonesian Family Life Survey, which tracks thousands of women across time between 1993 and 2014. And so we're able to observe how these women's labour force actually changes when they get married and when they have children. And so we're interested in examining how marriage and child rearing affect women's participation in the market. Do women move between the formal and the informal sectors, and do they move across industries? And so this graph just plots labour force participation of women by age, and it does it separately for single women, shown in blue, for married women in red, and for women with one child in green and